Hello and welcome to the Public Sector I Heart You podcast. My name is Manny Sandhu and I'm joined today by Shakil Butt, one of our very trusted West Midlands Employers associates. Hi Shakil.
Hi Manny.
So thanks for joining us today, Shakil. For those of the audience that don't know who you are, it'd be great just to learn a little bit more about your background and your career so far.
Thank you, Manny, and thank you for having me here today. So my career is a little bit varied. So I started in finance. I spent 20 years in finance. I've spent the last 16 years in HR, of which I spent 8 years as a HR director and the last 8 as a freelancer. I'm also a lecturer at Birmingham City University, where I lecture in strategic human resource management and leadership and development. And I'm also an author now, thankfully, an ambition that I've held on to for quite a while. And I've also been an associate with a number of organisations, including West Midlands Employers, where I think I've been an associate since 2021 now.
I believe so. And linked to that, I believe that you're also an accredited investigator.
I am indeed,
So
yes.
have supported in terms of public sector and third sector organisations, leading investigations around systemic racism and organisational failures.
So all kinds of discrimination, really. So whether it's bullying, harassment, discrimination around racism, sexism, homophobia, I get it all.
And that leads us on to the recent publication of your book, which has been regarded by, I know, HR Magazine as one of the best HR books for professionals to read. And Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Explained is the book. And I'm just keen to know a little bit more about that. What motivated you?
Well, I wanted to write a book for a while. Since I've been in this space for the last 5 years or 6 years now. I've written about 200 articles, mostly which have appeared in either People Management Magazine or HR Magazine or Personnel Today or HR Zone or HR Director Magazine. So I've been writing for a good while, but a book was always like that peak that I wanted to aspire towards. And Kogan Page reached out to me to ask me, could I write this book on this topic? I pitched a proposal, they liked it. And the rest is history. So it's roughly this time last year that I was asked to write this book. And it was quite a revelation for myself, actually, because, to research for the book, I thought I knew everything there was to know already. But actually, there's so much more to know. And this is such a growing and developing field, which is why it's Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Explained, because it's aimed at the new practitioner or somebody who's even been in this space for a while and actually having a rethink about what EDI really means to be impactful in workplaces.
And it's a really complex topic. So I like how you've said, even though you've been working and leading, including being, I think, a board member for inclusion for the CIPD,
right,
which is our leading professional board, there's still a lot to learn. It's such a complex topic. So that's really comforting to hear for other professionals that actually this is something that will help them wherever they are on that journey.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because what I found was in the EDI space, you'll have lots of people working in the field of EDI, but there's no benchmark or standard of what good looks like. And a lot of organizations, their EDI leads might be passionate about the topic. They might have their own lived experience. But what I've seen is there tends to be a tendency to replicate what others are doing, which isn't always the right thing to do for your organization or for you in your space. Or you might focus on one strand, and it might be the strand that you have the most affinity towards, but that's not necessarily the right thing to do for your organization. So really this is about taking a step back and actually rethinking what does it actually mean to be an EDI practitioner.
And on that note, was there anything particular that you were seeing in those HR environments that made you want to write the book and think this is something that we really need to look into further?
So to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. When I sat on the board for the CIPD, it became very apparent to me very quickly that actually we are the professional body which is meant to be advocating for inclusion, for belonging. And yet if you look at our professional body makeup, we were still very much a white profession in terms of the way we were presenting ourselves, very UK-centric, even though we're meant to be an international organisation. I'd go to HR director conferences and I'd look out into the audience and I'd see, to be frank, for want of a better word, a sea of white. And ironically, for a profession that's mostly made up of women, the senior positions were held by men. So that was very telling, I felt. And then I'd go to the student conferences, and what I'd see was there's not a shortage of talent coming into the pipeline. Very diverse backgrounds, very diverse people, but they're just not getting to that upper level of senior leaders in as HR leaders in organizations. And then when I was made redundant back in 2017, a lifetime ago now it feels like, I had 2 professional qualifications. I was a qualified accountant, and I was also a qualified HR practitioner. I'd been shortlisted at that point in time as HR Director of the Year. My team had won HR Team of the Year. And yet when I tried to find my next opportunity, I found actually I was up against it. It wasn't a level playing field. I'd see other HR leaders be appointed who I knew personally. I knew what they'd achieved, and not to take anything away from them, but I'd get through the first interview round, second interview round, and then I'd fall down at the third interview round. And I'd be like, okay, so if this is how difficult it is for me with what I've achieved, then how much harder must it be for someone who's got less of a history, less experience, or less qualifications? So that's really what got me focused on trying to be a voice for greater equity in the workplace, and actually holding the HR profession as a whole to account to say, actually, we need to do better than this. And because it's not going to be finance, it's not going to be internal audit, it's not going to be procurement, it's not going to be sales or marketing. No other function really has that responsibility to actually define the values, live the values, and embed the values, one of which should be inclusion and belonging.
Yeah. And as a profession, it's in effect, I suppose, practicing what we preach, and how actually we might be seen as role models, but for other professionals to actually lead by example and introduce that. But just on that note, from your experience, I'd be keen to understand from what you've seen, what you've experienced, and be working with these organisations, what tends to work, what works well in terms of supporting organisations on their EDI journey, or what doesn't work well, what might actually we be doing that makes scenarios worsen? Because I think organisations have tried, some more successful than others. So is there anything that you'd be able to shine a light on that for us?
So one of the biggest problems we've had, and it's not just limited to EDI, but a lot of practices, is this belief that there's best practice out there. And I don't believe in best practice, I believe in best fit. So there is a tendency, and I judge a number of awards. I judge the CIPD Awards, the HR Magazine Awards, I've judged Culture Pioneer Awards around inclusion. And what I tend to see is more of the same. I don't see really outstanding great work. I see organisations saying, we've got employee resource groups. Well, great, well done. We've done, pride marches. Okay, great, well done. My bigger question is, so what?
What's the impact?
What's the impact?
What's the difference?
What difference
that
has
it's
it
making?
made?
Yeah.
And sometimes when, I'll give an example, a piece of work I did with West Midlands Employers, actually. I won't mention the organisation because it's not about naming and shaming, but just to highlight what tends to happen. I was at a meeting with the employee resource group. It was a Black and Asian employee resource group, and it was attended by a senior leader. And the senior leader asked them the week before, well, next week is Black History Month. What do you want to do? And I was like, okay. And I spoke to the senior leader privately after, because again, it's not about embarrassing him or putting him on the spot. But I said, look, if it's next week, the message you've just given them is that, okay, yes, you're interested in doing something, but not so much that you haven't thought about it before the week before. It's too late. They're not going to come up with anything particularly great if it's next week. You haven't given them any time. You haven't talked about resources, planning. But how about having that conversation about what can we do next year? Let's start the conversation early and be part of that conversation. Because otherwise the message you've just given them now is that it doesn't really matter. So I don't think there's necessarily always bad intent, but sometimes there's poor execution. So
How
again,
it's landing
how it's
and
landed.
how it's been interpreted.
And a lot of employee resource groups, they don't have a clear mandate. They don't have an influence on how decisions are made. They don't have clear access to the most senior voice in the building. Unless you've got that, you end up with cynicism, becomes a moan and groan session, and actually becomes counterproductive. And then you wonder what's gone wrong, because you're like, well, we've got employee resource groups, but so what? Do they feel valued? Do they feel heard? Are they able to, do they feel dignified in their roles? Can they influence decision making? And if the answer is no to all those questions, then you haven't got anything really of any great value.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I know from conversations with senior leaders sometimes where they have got those employee groups, they have in effect introduce them with the vision that actually it will make a difference. And then there's sometimes that question, a disconnect. Actually, why aren't we hearing, or why aren't we hearing those voices and changes? And it's maybe because they haven't been given the authority or the right governance to actually make it successful.
No, absolutely. I mean, the other thing I've seen with EDI leads is actually the question is, where do they sit? Because where does equity, diversity, inclusion actually sit in the organisation? Often you hear, well, it sits with the EDI lead. No, it doesn't. It sits with everyone. It's not the responsibility of one person to fix what's wrong in an organisation. It's the responsibility of all the leaders and all the people involved in that organisation. And it's not about alienating anyone. It's about taking people on a journey, because if you go to any organisation, they're going to have faults. They're going to have challenges and barriers. That's okay. Be honest about the barriers. Be honest about the weaknesses and gaps. We haven't got, gender representation. Okay, be honest about that. What are you going to do about it to improve that? That's the real question I want to get to. It's not about naming and shaming, because if you're in this space, I can't do anything with your guilt and your shame. I can't do anything with that. What I can do is help you get to a better place and take you on that journey where we create awareness, empathy, and actually start seeing each other as equals and as people, really, I suppose. Not labels, not, my skin color doesn't define me. My gender doesn't define me. It's part of me, but it's not who I am. All of us are so much more than, the obvious differences.
Absolutely. And that reference around that accountability, that ownership, that sits all over the organisation, across the whole organisation, not just in terms of having a designated role. So that's really helpful. In terms of your experience, again, with West Midlands Employers and clients as well, what are some of the common failures in the HR space specifically that you might be seeing? So, what are some quick wins that we can consider? What are some initiatives or ways of working we can introduce that aren't necessarily going to be highly costly, because, as a sector, we are struggling financially, but also it's not like seen as a shiny new product and here we go, here's a programme and off you go. What are some of the things that we could start looking at and doing?
So I think when an organisation commits resources, and again, I'm not talking about a massive amount of resource, but some resource, it shows intent. Because if you're asking employee resource groups to fix the problems that they are themselves suffering from, that they didn't create, you're going to get pushback. If you're asking them to meet, as I've seen some organizations say, well, they meet in their lunch hour. Well, that's telling them that this is not important to you. So create some time for them to, space for them to have those conversations. Give them some resource to carry out some of their ideas. But more importantly, create that psychological safety. Because if you really want to understand what's wrong in an organization, it's not about what they did. They introduced pronouns in their organization. We should introduce pronouns. Why? Is that the burning issue? Do you think that's the biggest problem in your organization? You won't know unless you ask your people. So ask your people, ask them, create those safe spaces, have focus groups, have one-to-one conversations, and let them come up with, these are the barriers we experience at recruitment stage, performance, when performance reviews are taking place, at promotions, during grievances and disciplinaries. Let them explain to you what the barriers are, and let them help you come up with the solutions. And they don't have to be necessarily, costly, as you said. It can be just about, okay, there's a new policy coming out. Let them get involved in the design stage of the policy. So EDI should not be an afterthought or an add-on. It should be at the design stage where it's being conceptualized. We're going to do a new product. Well, okay, let's talk about the new product or service. Is it inclusive? How can we make it more inclusive before the product or service is actually fleshed out?
No, that co-design is really important, and I've certainly seen examples of when that's done well, that's achieved and made a difference. But it's also, as like you've said, the process of going through that feels inclusive. So it's inclusive by design as part of that delivery. Okay, that's it. So linked to that, in terms of, from it being HR professionals, it might be employee groups themselves trying to have those conversations and create that psychological safety. One of the things that I'm very conscious of is that we are in quite a politically volatile environment at the moment, and probably what we are seeing in public is probably not something that we've seen to the same extent historically. So from HR professionals' perspective, how can we help HR professionals navigate that challenging environment to making sure that from an organisational perspective, we are absolutely meeting our legal requirements, but we're also doing more. We're doing what morally we need to be doing. We are doing what we know from a business case perspective. We are creating a more inclusive organisation. But what would be your advice be to HR?
I suppose my advice would be to read the book, because I do talk about this in quite
That's
great
a nice
detail.
little plug there. Brilliant.
But the reality is, if you think about legislation, one of the biggest pieces of legislation was the Equal Pay Act, 1970. That was 55 years ago. And we're still struggling with equal pay. Women are still being underpaid for doing the same or similar work as a man. So if you think about the fact that it's 55 years on, we still haven't cracked that one. It's actually recognizing legislation is not your solution. Legislation is there to, as a bare minimum, really, I suppose, as a better way, best way to think about
framework
it. It's a framework
to work within.
But it's never going to fix your problems in an organisation. 1975 saw the Sex Discrimination Act. 1976 was the Race Relations Act. It wasn't until 1995 that the Disability Discrimination Act came into effect. 19 years later, and that should tell you actually there's a real pushback to bring about to adopt change. So that's not going to come from legislation, and legislation is not the solution. But the solution will come from really understanding what is, and not following fads either, I should say. So one of the reasons we've had such a focus around certain strands, so, the LGBT community have done really well in terms of Stonewall being created as a charity, being politically active since 1989. We had the focus around gender in 2017 because of the gender pay gap, the Me Too movement. In 2020, we had the George Floyd murder. So race became, a priority for many organizations. 2021, we had the Sarah Everard murder and the response of the police to the protests that were taking place. So certain things will flux over a period of time. And it's not about following fads. It's actually about being consistent. If you are generally saying these are our values as an organization, and most organizations talk about inclusion or being authentic, or having integrity, they will use these words on their slogans and their frameworks. But actually understanding what does that really mean, and it means ignoring what's happening in terms of fads and not jumping ship when it becomes difficult. Because right now it's difficult. It is difficult. There's a big pushback on EDI, and I'm actually welcoming it simply because it means people are being forced to ask the question: well, is our employee resource group working? Does EDI really sit in the right place? Because I've always believed it should have stayed within HR. It shouldn't have been standalone, because a lot of EDI, in the early 2020s, there was a big push to get lots of EDI leads into organizations who are passionate about their topic, but many of them had their lived experience, but also their own trauma. And they focused on the strand that they had the most affinity towards. That was never going to be a solution then. If you've got somebody who's very passionate about one particular strand, well, yeah, great. That's good news for that strand, but not great news for everybody else. So you need to have a more holistic approach. It needs to be more intersectional, but it also needs to sit within a place in the organisation where it's got some teeth. We talk about HR struggling at the boardroom to have a voice. So you can imagine where ADI sits.
Absolutely.
So it's actually even further afield
where
compared
should
to
it
HR.
have the most impact and influence to have those conversations? Yeah.
So one of the tells I had when I was working with an organisation, again, it was a public sector organisation, and I was being asked to come in and do some training for the senior leadership team. It kept being deferred. And I said, that already tells me where EDI sits in your organisation. That's quite, that speaks volumes.
Quite telling in itself.
Yeah.
And in terms of, and I heard it just this morning actually in a conversation with colleagues, we're probably a decade behind when it comes to diversity for very senior roles as a sector in local government. And I absolutely agree with you in terms of actually it's welcome to have that lens on EDI, questioning where does it sit? Is it making a difference? What difference? Impact? How do we ensure we continue to have those conversations and continue in that journey, because we are nowhere near where we need to be. Is there anything else that you'd be giving advice to those senior leaders as well about how they look at EDI across their organisation?
So I suppose one of the hardest things to do with senior leaders is to allow them to let go of their own fear, because a lot of times leaders feel that if they give up power to somebody who's different, because it is about, if it's a room full of, let's say it's a boardroom full of white men, that's quite a scary thing to be able to give up power to say, actually, we're going to allow difference into this boardroom. And it's about trying to break those fears down, actually, by using research to show there's no new surprise that research from McKinsey has repeatedly shown if you've got people who are from ethnic backgrounds, different genders, they actually help performance. There's a real business case for actually bringing difference into the board, because it allows you to think differently. And it's a great saying from General S. Patton, who said, if everyone is thinking the same, then no one is thinking. And that is, I think, very revealing, because if we all are singing from the same hymn sheet, working in an environment where there's constant change, we're going to come up with the same solutions every single time, and we are going to become very quickly obsolete. Whereas if you've got a demographic community throughout the organization, not just at the bottom end of the organization, but actually throughout the organization, you're going to be better placed to actually represent and reflect the needs of the communities that you're serving. So one of the councils I worked with through West Midlands Employers is actually very telling in that they said to me, but we don't have that diversity inside the council. I said, well, about the community you're serving, very diverse. Then how do you understand their needs? How do they relate to you? How do they see themselves represented and reflected in you as a council? They don't. So you're always going to have that sticking point about how to communicate and connect with them effectively, because there's nobody inside your organisation that looks like them. But we can't find, we haven't got anyone to sit on our recruitment panels who is diverse. I said, but that's an easy fix. You get someone like me as a consultant to join your panels, so when somebody comes in from a diverse background, they see someone who looks like them, they're more inclined to see, actually, I have a future here. And they'll be coming forward. But if I come to an organisation and I go to the interview panel and everyone looks the same, whether that's gender, ethnicity, disability, and I don't see myself reflected, I've got a message already in my mind that I'm never going to do well in this organisation. People like me here do not succeed. So representation absolutely matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is we need to be also thinking about the future workforce, and how do we deliver outreach programs? How are we working with schools, universities, colleges, and community groups? So how do we widen the net to actually start thinking about what that inclusion and diversity looks like for that future workforce as well? Sometimes we hear that actually they're hard groups that we can't get represented, but actually when we look at the community groups, sometimes we're doing a lot of work with those community groups. So I think that's something that we can certainly think about and take away, is actually how do we bring in more representation if we haven't got it in the organisations.
So a lot of organisations tend to do what I see is they have their doors open, which is they put the adverts on their websites and on certain websites related to their sector. But what they're not thinking about is that there's lots of actually platforms out there where you can focus on specific strands of diversity to say, actually, we're recruiting, and place that advert on their platforms. So you'll actually attract a different crowd. It's not that difficult. It really isn't. But it's about what we're doing currently and what else could we be doing. And again, I cover that, I think, in chapter 7.
Excellent. Thank you, Noah. I look forward to giving the book another read. It's been really helpful, I know, to myself and other colleagues already that have had a look at the book. So thank you again for giving us a showcase today.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Manny.